Imagine this. It's a perfectly ordinary Saturday morning in a subdivision that takes pride in symmetry, polite nods, and very serious conversations about holiday light alignment. The sun is doing its patient golden thing, birds are in full chorus, and the smell of someone's freshly brewed coffee drifts lazily across the cul-de-sac. From the curb, everything looks calm. Manicured hedges, neat driveways, and the kind of order that makes people trust bylaws as if they were family heirlooms. But knock on the door of any mailbox and you'll find the undercurrent, a culture of petty precision and a roster of grievances that could fill a novella. Scratch the surface and you find the neighborhood's real heartbeat: rivalry. Not the casual, we're just kidding kind of competition, but a slow-burning feud that has been handed down like an heirloom. North side against south side. Decorations versus regulations. Pride versus pride. The lines are invisible and rigid, and if you lived on one side, you knew exactly who your opponent was. It wasn't personal at first, just tradition. Then tradition calcified into grudges, and grudges became the comfortable background noise of our lives. It started with small things that somehow meant everything. A misaligned wreath on a porch became code for disrespect. A mailbox painted a hue slightly off the prescribed palette was treated like a moral failing. The annual park cleanup, ostensibly a civic act, morphed into an arms race of trash bags counted as trophies. North Side folks kept meticulous tallies. South Side accused them of dramatic double bagging for attention. Our HOA newsletter drifted away from community updates and toward a column of grievances. Anonymous notes circulated like modern town criers, and people kept evidence: photos, footprints, screenshots, like battle relics. When rules designed to foster cohesion are twisted into tools for dominance, the rules lose their purpose and gain teeth. Covenants, once intended to protect property values and common aesthetics, were repurposed as instruments of status and influence. The Enforcement Committee earned a reputation for zeal, measuring hedges with calipers, debating ethical limits of inflatable flamingos, and brandishing clipboard-style authority like ceremonial scepters. Violation forms became letters of rhetorical love, passionate, pointed, and always meant to sting. Oddly enough, many of us took comfort in the feud. It gave the neighborhood identity. The monthly meetings provided drama, and drama is addictive. Predictable plots, recurring antagonists, and the rare but delicious outrage when someone left a trash bin out beyond the allotted hour. We laughed, we plotted, we circulated printed photos with circles and arrows like evidence in a sitcom trial. It was a theater, and we were the devoted audience. Yet beneath the performative outrage, neighbors practiced quiet contradictions. The same people who fought over lattice color were often the ones dropping casseroles on porches during recovery from surgery. Anonymous deeds, shoveling a driveway at dawn, returning a lost child's bike to a porch, or leaving a flashlight for a family with no power, hinted at a softer ledger of kindness. We were rivals in the public square and sometimes strangers who did favors in private. That duality mattered. It meant the feud was built on habit and identity more than on total hatred. Understanding that fragile, contradictory pattern is essential because it sets the stage for what came next, a crisis that blew through our carefully curated disputes and forced a brutal reevaluation of priority. This was not a minor inconvenience. It was the kind of emergency that shrinks the headline grievances of a newsletter into embarrassing footnotes. When the crisis hit, abrupt, uncompromising, and uninvited, our theater of rivalry met a real, practical test. Suddenly, petty points and neighborhood one-upmanship felt absurd. The mailbox scandal felt small compared to figuring out who had a working generator, who could boil water safely, and who had the truck to pull a fallen tree out of a lane so an ambulance could pass. The currency of community shifted from snide commentary to shared resource lists. Overnight, the checklist of priorities changed. Fuel and food trumped hedge height. The old scripts didn't apply. Transformation, though, rarely arrives as a tidy montage. It was messy, awkward, and full of suspicion.
Early attempts at cooperation were laced with side eyes. Neighbors who once kept score hesitantly knocked on one another's doors, asking not for enforcement, but for help. Board members who argued about whether a blue trim trespassed into teal now debated how to allocate bottled water. People swapped grudges for chainsaw tips. The dynamics were unfamiliar. Not everyone adjusted at once. And that is where this story truly begins. Not at the moment of disaster itself, but at the awkward human crossroads where rivalry met necessity. It's where fences, literal and figurative, started trembling, and where the first tentative steps toward an unexpected alliance were taken. Ready? Next, we'll dig deeper into the pre-crisis landscape so you can feel just how unlikely what came after really was.
Before the crisis, before the sirens and the power outages, before the emergency meetings under candlelight, the neighborhood was defined by a very different kind of drama, the HOA soap opera. And believe me, it was award-worthy. Forget reality TV. This was suburban gladiator combat disguised as bake sales and bylaws. The feud went back decades. On one side, the North Side. Their reputation? By-the-book perfectionists. They had HOA covenants practically tattooed on their forearms. North Side lawns looked like they'd been designed with laser levels and geometry software. If a blade of grass dared to grow at a rebellious angle, you'd better believe a mower appeared like a tactical response team. Driveways were pressure-washed weekly. Holiday lights were measured by extension cord length. And heaven help the poor soul who parked a car facing the wrong direction overnight. Northside prided itself on discipline, tradition, and the smug satisfaction of catching rule breakers in the act. On the other side, the South Side, known for relaxed attitudes, slightly wilder lawns, and, let's be honest, parties that lasted a little too late into the evening. Their hedges might have been uneven, their fences painted colors not explicitly sanctioned by the HOA cullet, and yes, their trash bins sometimes lingered at the curb longer than allowed. But Southside claimed something more important: community spirit. They gathered spontaneously, they bent rules when kindness mattered, and they mocked Northside's obsession with appearances. To them, the HOA wasn't a governing body, it was a nuisance with a logo. The rivalry wasn't violent, but it was constant. Every year, there were competitions. Not official ones, of course, but events where each side tried to outdo the other. Take the annual park cleanup. Technically, the goal was to clear litter and prepare the shared space for spring. In practice, it was war with trash bags. Northside arrived with coordinated gloves, neon vests, and a spreadsheet for debris zones. Southside rolled in late, armed with music, donuts, and the unshakable confidence that fun counted as effort. Northside scoffed at their lack of structure. Southside mocked the spreadsheets. By the end, the park was spotless, but so were the resentment levels. Polished, sharp, and ready for the next round. Then came the holiday light season. Oh, the lights. If Northside had drones, they would have used them to align roof icicles at a 90-degree angle. Southside? They went for flash, inflatable Santas, neon reindeer, tacky blow-up snow globes bigger than compact cars. It wasn't about elegance, it was about who could make cars slow down and stare. Northside dismissed it as gaudy chaos. Southside called Northside's uniform white bulbs boring funeral lights. Every December turned into a war of aesthetics, with the HOA board pretending to remain neutral while secretly tallying which side had generated the most complaints. Complaints, by the way, were a sport of their own. Northside weaponized the violation notice. If Southside's grass grew even half an inch over the 3.5-inch rule, a letter appeared in the mailbox by sunrise. Southside retaliated with loophole humor, painting fences in creative interpretations of approved colors, pushing the HOA's patience like toddlers testing bedtime rules. Southside once threw a barbecue on a Northside driveway, just to prove driveway usage wasn't explicitly defined in the covenants. The HOA fined them. Southside paid with coins, pennies, nickels, dimes. It was petty art. All of this might sound silly, but here's the truth. HOA disputes are rarely about grass or mailboxes. They're about control, pride, and identity. A study once showed that 40% of HOA disputes that escalate aren't really about rules at all. They're about relationships gone sour.
And that was our neighborhood in a nutshell. The bylaws were the chess pieces. The real game was ego. At board meetings, you could practically feel the rivalry in the air. Picture it, a folding table at the front, a row of stern board members, and an audience of restless homeowners ready to pounce. Northside folks arrived with notes, highlighted bylaws, and a readiness to cite page numbers like lawyers. Southside residents leaned back in their chairs, arms crossed, muttering jokes just loud enough to be heard. Every discussion, whether about repainting the community sign or fixing potholes, spiraled into an arena. You'd think we were debating foreign policy, not mulch choices. Even kids picked sides. Northside kids bragged about their perfect yards, while Southside kids bragged about not caring. When the high school sports teams played, you could spot which families rooted for which side based on where they sat in the bleachers. Rivalry seeped into birthday parties, garage sales, and even dog walking routes. Dogs, by the way, were another battleground. Northside demanded leashes no longer than 4 feet. Southside unleashed, "Oops, he got away again," with suspicious regularity. And yet, for all the bitterness, we depended on the feud. It gave the neighborhood personality. It was entertainment, identity, and tradition wrapped into one. Without the rivalry, we feared we'd just be another bland subdivision with vinyl siding and silent streets. So we nurtured it, exaggerated it, kept it alive like a campfire we couldn't let go out. It was our own little suburban opera, and we were both the cast and the audience. But here's the twist. Beneath the rivalry was always a thin thread of respect. As much as Northside rolled their eyes at Southside's chaos, they secretly admired their spirit. As much as Southside mocked Northside's obsession with rules, they grudgingly respected their organization. Nobody admitted it out loud, but both sides knew they needed each other. They were yin and yang, order and freedom, spreadsheets and barbecue smoke. And maybe, just maybe, that's why when crisis struck, the stage was already set for transformation. Because when disaster rolls in, the things that divide us suddenly feel laughably small. You don't care if your neighbor's hedge is half an inch too tall. You care if they'll lend you a flashlight. You don't argue about Christmas lights. You argue about who has gas for the generator. And in those moments, grudges dissolve faster than HOA reserve funds during a pool repair. That was our neighborhood. Primed with years of ridiculous tension, ready for a crisis that would shake everything we thought we knew about each other. And once it arrived, there was no going back.
When disaster strikes a neighborhood, it rarely announces itself politely. There's no, "Excuse me, may I interrupt your feud over mailbox paint?" No. Crisis barges in like a drunk uncle at Thanksgiving, flips the table, and dares everyone to stop fighting and start surviving. For us, that moment came with a gut punch, the suburban apocalypse. It began on a Tuesday night, a deceptively ordinary one. Northside lawns glistened from a fresh sprinkler cycle. Southside driveways were littered with evidence of a spontaneous barbecue. And the HOA Facebook group was still smoldering from a 97 comment thread about hedge trimming. Then the lights flickered. First a blink, then a blackout. Entire blocks plunged into darkness, leaving only the glow of cell phone screens and the sudden collective realization this wasn't just a fuse. The grid was down. Now, most neighborhoods treat a power outage like a minor inconvenience. Flashlights, candles, maybe some melted ice cream. But our rivalry turned even darkness into a competition. Northside had generators, big, loud, industrial things that roared like motorcycles and smelled like gasoline. Within minutes, you could hear them powering up. Southside? They had none. Instead, they treated the blackout like an impromptu block party. Out came the fire pits, the guitars, the coolers. For the first few hours, it felt like the feud had simply found a new stage. But then reality set in. The outage stretched from hours into days. Refrigerators warmed, freezers melted. Northside's precious generators ran on fuel, and fuel doesn't magically appear when every gas station is shut down. Southside's party atmosphere dissolved once kids grew restless and elderly residents started coughing in unheated homes. Suddenly, it wasn't about bragging rights. It was about survival. The first real crack appeared on day 2. A North Side family's generator sputtered out at 3 a.m. They'd been meticulous with fuel rationing, but the tank ran dry. They stood in the driveway, clutching flashlights, realizing they had no backup. Who had extra fuel? Southside! The very neighbors Northside mocked for poor planning had been stockpiling gas for weekend bonfires. The irony was brutal. The family faced a choice: swallow their pride or freeze. Meanwhile, Southside had water issues. Their homes sat closer to the low-lying part of the neighborhood, and without power, the water pumps failed. Faucets trickled, then dried. Northside, perched higher, still had partial reserves. Cue the awkward knock-knock. Remember when you fined us for leaving recycling bins out too long? Cool. Anyway, could we borrow a few gallons of water? Awkward doesn't begin to describe it. Imagine years of petty battles culminating in midnight handshakes over buckets of water. Northside neighbors who once bragged about bylaws were now quietly slipping jugs across property lines. Southside families who once roasted Northside's obsession with rules were now huddled in their orderly kitchens, grateful for clean drinking water. The feud wasn't gone, it was just momentarily drowned out by necessity. By day 3, the neighborhood looked less like a suburb and more like a survival camp. Extension cords snaked across lawns like spaghetti, fire pits burned at odd hours. Kids, usually divided by invisible lines, played together in the streets, trading snacks and flashlights. It was chaotic, messy, and strangely united. The HOA board, usually obsessed with aesthetic violations, suddenly found themselves chairing emergency meetings. Instead of debating hedge height, they debated fuel rations. Instead of bylaws, they drafted survival plans. And here's the kicker. The very structure of the HOA, the thing that usually fueled division, became the skeleton of survival. Those dreaded email chains turned into lifelines. The same clipboard warriors who used to measure grass height now coordinated which households had medical needs, who had spare supplies, and where to set up a communal cooking station. For once, enforcement gave way to empathy. Still, tension lingered. Pride doesn't vanish overnight. On day 4, a shouting match erupted when Northside accused Southside of siphoning too much generator power. Southside fired back, reminding everyone that Northside once fined them for unsanctioned tiki porches. The argument might have escalated into a brawl if not for an elderly resident stepping forward, clutching her oxygen tank. In that moment, the room went silent. Ego shriveled. Priority snapped into focus. Disaster has a way of stripping people down to the essentials. You stop caring about who won the holiday light contest 3 years ago. You care about who has medicine, who can fix a broken chainsaw, and who's willing to watch your kids while you scavenge for supplies. Our neighborhood was relearning the basics of humanity, one awkward collaboration at a time. By the end of the week, rival dads who once exchanged passive-aggressive scares were hauling fallen branches together. Moms who once gossiped about bake sale sabotage now baked side by side, pooling flour and sugar like wartime rations. Teenagers, normally glued to screens, discovered the lost art of flashlight tag. And the HOA newsletter? It transformed overnight into a survival bulletin. Fuel schedules, safety updates, morale quotes. The passive-aggressive tone was gone. In its place was urgency, hope, and, dare I say it, unity. The irony was delicious. The very crisis that threatened to tear us apart was the one thing that forced us to lean in. Rivalries melted in the firelight of necessity. Pride was swallowed in exchange for warmth. And grudges, so carefully cultivated over decades, suddenly felt like dead weight we couldn't afford to carry. That was the unfolding crisis, not just the blackout, but the collapse of old patterns. It was the neighborhood realizing in real time that our survival depended not on HOA rules or lawn perfection, but on something far older and simpler: cooperation. It was messy, it was reluctant, but it was real. And once that crack in the armor appeared, there was no way to go back to the way things were. If the crisis was the spark, then the alliance was the fire. But make no mistake, it wasn't some Disney-style montage where enemies hugged, soft music played, and everyone roasted marshmallows under one big American flag. No, this alliance was awkward, reluctant, and filled with just enough sarcasm to keep things interesting. And that's exactly what made it beautiful. The first real alliance moment happened on day 5. A Northside family's generator broke. Not sputtered, broke. The engine coughed, choked, and gave up like a teenager asked to clean their room. Normally, Northside would have called a repair service, but the grid was down, cell towers were overloaded, and YouTube tutorials don't mean much when your phone's battery is dead. So they did the unthinkable. They crossed into Southside territory. The site was legendary. Mr. Henderson, the king of HOA rule enforcement, walking across the street holding a broken generator cord like a white flag. The man who once fined Southside neighbors for leaving inflatable flamingos up past Easter was now muttering, "Do you guys know anything about small engines?" Southside erupted in laughter, but here's the kicker. They helped. Not out of pity, but because survival had turned everyone into reluctant teammates. They hauled out tools, tinkered in the driveway, and by nightfall, the generator purred back to life. A truce was born. From there, the cooperation snowballed. Northside had fuel, Southside had manpower. Southside had chainsaws, Northside had medical supplies. Suddenly, skill sets and stockpiles mattered more than grudges. Rival dads who once competed in lawn care were now competing to see who could cut down fallen branches fastest. Moms who once exchanged shade over bake sale brownies were now sharing recipes for meals that could be cooked on a camp stove with 3 ingredients or less. It was like Survivor, Suburban Edition, except the prize was simply making it through another night. One of the wildest moments came when the HOA board itself, yes, the same board famous for policing mailbox colors, organized a joint effort. They set up a community relief station in the clubhouse. Tables once used for heated arguments about fence heights now held jugs of water, can woods, and battery packs. The same clipboard warriors who once measured lawns with rulers were now measuring out cups of soup for kids. It was surreal, and yet it worked. The HOA, for once, was useful. The alliance wasn't just logistical, it was emotional. You started to see neighbors as people, not as caricatures. Remember Mrs. Callahan, the Southside woman rumored to have sabotaged Northside's brownies? Turns out she was also a retired nurse. She spent the crisis checking in on elderly residents, changing bandages, and teaching teenagers how to sterilize water with bleach. Her enemy status evaporated. Suddenly, she wasn't the brownie saboteur, she was a lifesaver. Or take Mr. Peterson, the Northside enforcer who once wrote a 4-page letter about a hedge growing 1 inch too tall. Turns out he was a skilled carpenter. When a storm knocked down fences, he rallied kids from both sides and rebuilt them, not as property dividers, but as shared fortifications against looters. His grumpy exterior didn't soften, but his actions spoke louder than bylaws. Kids noticed too. Rival cliques vanished. Southside teens who once blasted music at 2 a.m. teamed up with Northside honor students to patrol the neighborhood at night with flashlights, ensuring no one was left vulnerable. Younger kids who previously only played in their sides of yards started roaming freely, treating the entire subdivision as one big playground. The crisis had erased the invisible boundary lines faster than any HOA amendment could. There were funny moments, too, because humor sneaks in when you least expect it. Like the time Southside threw together a blackout talent show in someone's garage. Northside families, at first skeptical, eventually joined in. Picture strict, buttoned-up Northside dads performing terrible shadow puppets while Southside moms laughed until they cried. That night, the sound of laughter echoed louder than the sound of generators. For the first time in years, the two sides weren't rivals, they were just neighbors having fun. And then came the turning point. Trust. Real, genuine trust. It happened slowly, but it was undeniable. Southside entrusted Northside with their last working medical cooler, knowing insulin doses depended on it. Northside gave Southside keys to a storage shed with emergency supplies. In a neighborhood where people used to file complaints over trampoline placement, this was revolutionary. Trust was the currency, and for once, it was being spent generously. Of course, not everyone was thrilled. A few holdouts clung to the rivalry like it was oxygen. "We can't just forget decades of rule-breaking," one Northsider barked during a meeting. "They left their Christmas decorations up until February." But even he had to admit, when Southside teenagers rescued his cat from a fallen tree, the rivalry was hard to justify. Pet rescues have a way of humbling people. The alliance deepened with every passing day. By the second week, it wasn't Northside versus Southside, it was us. The survival groups merged. Supplies were pooled, roles were assigned not by HOA status, but by skills. One resident was dubbed the generator whisperer, another became the bread lady. A teenager who had once been caught egging houses became the unofficial neighborhood runner, dashing from block to block delivering notes and supplies. Everyone mattered, everyone contributed. And here's the most delicious irony of all. The alliance worked because of the rivalry. Think about it. Years of competing had made each side hyper-aware of their strengths. Northside knew logistics, Southside knew improvisation. Together, they were unstoppable. It was like pairing Batman with the Joker, but making them co-managers of a survival squad. Dysfunctional, messy, but effective. By the time outside help finally arrived, the neighborhood didn't look like a war zone. It looked like a team. Houses were battered, sure, but the people inside were stronger than ever. Neighbors who once glared at each other in HOA meetings were now swapping inside jokes. Rivalries had morphed into friendships, and alliances had replaced boundaries. The unexpected alliance wasn't just a survival tactic. It was the birth of a new culture. One where grudges didn't vanish, but were overshadowed by something bigger, the realization that survival, and frankly happiness, was better shared.
When the crisis finally eased, when the power flickered back on, the water flowed again, and the emergency crews cleared the last fallen branches, our neighborhood looked the same on the surface. The lawns were still there, the mailboxes still stood in neat rows, and the HOA sign still boasted its motto, "Community First." But beneath that familiar facade, something fundamental had changed. We weren't two neighborhoods anymore. We weren't Northside and Southside, spreadsheets and barbecue pits. We were one. And let me tell you, that unity was as shocking as a Southside teenager willingly showing up to a 7 a.m. park cleanup. The transformation didn't happen overnight. At first, people assumed things would go back to normal, that the old grudges would return like crabgrass once the adrenaline wore off. But here's the funny thing. Normal no longer fit. After weeks of relying on each other for survival, no one could look at their neighbors the same way again. Once you've shared soup in a clubhouse by candlelight or borrowed fuel for a generator in the middle of a freezing night, it's pretty hard to go back to glaring at someone over mailbox paint colors. Take the HOA meetings, for instance. Pre-crisis, they were battlefields. Northside weaponized rules. Southside weaponized sarcasm. After the crisis, the vibe shifted. Meetings started with thank yous instead of accusations. Instead of debating the length of acceptable lawn grass, we debated how to create a neighborhood emergency fund. Instead of arguing over Christmas lights, we planned a shared tool shed so no one would have to face another chainsaw shortage. It was practical, efficient, and, dare I say, civil. The HOA newsletter, once a passive-aggressive novella of complaints, became a genuine source of community news. Birthdays, volunteer opportunities, recipes, even a spotlight section for neighbors who went above and beyond. When the dust settled, when the power hummed back and the HOA newsletter returned to its monthly rhythm, the question on everyone's mind was, what now?
Sure, we'd survived a blackout, rebuilt fences, and turned rivals into allies. But what lessons could we actually carry forward, beyond the novelty of having shared chili recipes with our sworn enemies? That's where the real story lies, in what the crisis taught us about community, HOAs, and, frankly, human stubbornness. Lesson 1. Petty rules collapse under real pressure. You'd be amazed how fast a rule about hedge height loses its authority when there's no electricity, no water, and no clear end in sight. During the crisis, not once did anyone measure grass. Not once did a violation notice appear. The clipboard warriors became soup ladlers and supply managers. Why? Because the rules had been designed for normal times, not survival. And that's the thing, most HOA battles aren't about necessity. They're about aesthetics, pride, and control. The crisis exposed how fragile those rules really are and how irrelevant they become when survival enters the chat. But lesson 2 was even more powerful. Community is stronger than rivalry. For years, North Side and South Side defined themselves in opposition. But when we pooled resources, when we trusted each other, the synergy was undeniable. North Side's structure balanced South Side's flexibility. South Side's creativity balanced North Side's precision. It wasn't just about making it through the blackout. It was about seeing firsthand that differences aren't weaknesses. They're assets. The very traits we mocked in each other turned out to be survival tools. That's a lesson any community could use, HOA or not. Lesson 3. Pride can bend, but it doesn't have to break. Let's be real, no one suddenly became a saint. North Side didn't start loving inflatable Santas, and South Side didn't fall in love with spreadsheets. What changed was the willingness to bend. Pride, that same stubborn pride that fueled decades of rivalry, softened just enough to allow compromise. And in that bending, respect grew. You don't need to erase pride to build unity. You just need to redirect it. If pride is the fuel, cooperation can be the engine. Lesson 4. HOAs have untapped potential. Yes, I said it. Those same organizations that sometimes feel like bureaucratic overlords also have the structure to lead in times of crisis. Our HOA newsletter, once infamous for passive-aggressive tirades about fence colors, became the emergency lifeline. The board, once derided as nitpickers, became coordinators who mapped out resources, managed supplies, and scheduled shifts. It turns out, when you strip away the pettiness, an HOA is actually well-positioned to help communities organize fast. The problem isn't the existence of rules, it's the misuse of them. Lesson 5. Wait until crisis, and you've waited too long. This one stings. It took a blackout for us to realize we could work together. But what if we'd built that trust earlier? How much easier would it have been if North Side and South Side had prepared together, instead of silently stockpiling and silently hoping the other side would fail? The truth is, unity shouldn't be an emergency plan. It should be the baseline. The blackout was our wake-up call, but we shouldn't need chaos to remind us we're better as a team. Lesson 6. Every neighborhood has hidden heroes. Before the crisis, most people were defined by their worst qualities. Mrs. Callahan was the brownie saboteur. Mr. Peterson was the hedge inspector. But when the lights went out, new roles emerged. Callahan became the nurse. Peterson became the carpenter. Teenagers became couriers. Kids became morale boosters. Everyone had something to contribute. The crisis forced us to look beyond the caricatures and see the full humans living next door. And once you see that, it's hard to unsee it. Lesson 7. Conflict is easier than cooperation, but not better. It's easy to feud. It's easy to nitpick, complain, and cling to the smug satisfaction of catching someone breaking a bylaw. Cooperation is harder. It requires humility, compromise, and patience. But the payoff? 10 times greater. Our neighborhood learned that the energy we once spent on rivalry, if redirected, could build something remarkable. Feuds are entertaining, sure, but cooperation builds legacies. And finally, lesson 8. Unity is contagious. Post-crisis, our neighborhood didn't just change internally, word spread. Nearby subdivisions started asking, "How did you pull that off? How did you go from rivals to allies?" Realtors bragged about us, visitors noticed the vibe, even the local news covered our miraculous neighborhood transformation. And you know what? It wasn't miraculous. It was messy, awkward, and begrudging. But it worked. And seeing it work inspired others to believe they could do the same. These lessons aren't just HOAs specific. They're universal. Whether it's a subdivision, a workplace, or even a family, the principles are the same. Petty disputes can dominate until something bigger reminds us what really matters. Crisis doesn't change who people are. It reveals it. And when it reveals resilience, compassion, and cooperation, it builds a new foundation that's stronger than any covenant, condition, or restriction ever drafted. But here's the kicker. You don't have to wait for a crisis. We didn't choose our blackout, but we can choose the lessons it taught us. You don't need a disaster to knock on your rival's door and ask for help or to offer it. You don't need an emergency to see the humanity in someone you've written off as the enemy. What if instead of waiting for the next storm, the next outage, the next emergency, we acted like neighbors now? Because here's the uncomfortable truth. The crisis will come again. Maybe not a blackout. Maybe a flood, a fire, a pandemic, or something we can't even predict. And when it does, the neighborhoods that thrive will be the ones that learn the lesson early, that invested in trust before panic set in. That, more than anything else, is the takeaway. Don't wait until your HOA newsletter transforms into a survival manual. Start rewriting the narrative now. So yes, our neighborhood came out stronger. Yes, we became an example of rivals turned allies. But the real victory wasn't surviving the crisis. It was realizing we could live differently afterward. That we didn't have to go back to the same old petty fights. That unity wasn't just a blackout fluke. It could be our new normal if we chose it. And that choice, dear viewer, is the real lesson for tomorrow.
And there it is, the story of how a neighborhood feud that once revolved around hedge clippers, Christmas lights, and passive-aggressive HOA newsletters transformed into something almost unrecognizable, a genuine community. Not a perfect one, not one without quirks or disagreements, but a community that finally figured out the difference between fighting to win and working to survive. When I look back, the irony still makes me laugh. Years of drama, of smug glances across driveways, of secret screenshot evidence uploaded to HOA Facebook threads, all it took to dismantle it was a week without power. A storm knocked out the grid, but in doing so, it knocked down the walls between us. Who knew unity was hiding just beneath the surface of all those silly rivalries? And let's be honest, it's not like we're saints now. Northside still rolls their eyes at Southside's inflatable yard decor, and Southside still ribs Northside about their obsession with bylaws written in 8-point Times New Roman font. The difference is, those jokes don't sting anymore. They're part of the fabric. They remind us of who we were and how far we've come. They're the scar tissue from the feud. And scar tissue, as any doctor will tell you, is tougher than the skin that came before it. So, what's the takeaway here? It's simple. Don't wait for disaster to realize your rival might actually be your ally. You don't need a blackout to knock on their door. You don't need a crisis to find out that the woman who once complained about your Christmas lights is actually the retired nurse who'll show up when you need medical advice. Or that the man who once lectured you about hedge height is the same guy who can rebuild a fence faster than a contractor. Community isn't forged by bylaws or newsletters. It's forged by choice. Every time you wave instead of glare, every time you forgive instead of fine, every time you offer a hand instead of writing a complaint, that's when the fabric of real unity is woven. The HOA can set the rules, but it's the people who set the tone. So here's my challenge to you, watching this right now. Think about your neighborhood rival. You know who I mean, the one who parks too close to your mailbox, the one who never cleans up after their dog, the one who makes HOA meetings feel like courtroom dramas. Now ask yourself, if a crisis hit tomorrow, would you want them on your side? And more importantly, are you willing to be on theirs? Because trust me, when the power goes out and the world feels uncertain, you won't care who won the bake sale. You'll care who shows up with the flashlight. You won't care who had the prettier lawn. You'll care who helps clear the fallen tree blocking the road. You won't care who wrote what in the HOA newsletter. You'll care who checks in to make sure your family is safe. That's the heart of this story. That's the lesson hidden under all the sarcasm and sass. Rivals are fun. Feuds are entertaining. But neighbors, the kind you can count on, that's priceless. So if you're nodding along right now, maybe it's time to stop seeing your neighborhood as a battlefield and start seeing it as a team. If we can turn decades of ridiculous rivalry into a functioning alliance, trust me, your block can handle putting aside a dog poop complaint. And now I'll toss it to you. Would you help your neighborhood rival in a crisis, or would you slam the door and let karma do its thing? Drop your answer in the comments. I'm dying to know how savage or saintly you'd be. If you got something out of this story, hit that like button. It helps more than you think. Subscribe for more jaw-dropping HOA battles, unexpected twists, and stories that prove suburbia is anything but boring. And hey, share this video with that neighbor you're secretly feuding with. Who knows, maybe this will be the first step towards your own unlikely alliance. Until next time, may your fences stay sturdy, your bylaws stay sane, and your neighbors surprise you in the best way possible.